Toxic parents who kicked me out at 18. 3 days ago, I, 28 celebrated my son's 3rd birthday with friends from work and a few of his daycare buddies. I even invited my estranged parents, who reached out 2 weeks prior, asking for a chance to reconcile. To give you some context, my parents kicked me out on my 18th birthday, just months before I was set to start college. Their lack of love and support during my childhood made their decision unsurprising. They'd never been particularly nurturing. The only reason they waited until I turned 18 was likely because they didn't want to face legal repercussions for throwing me out sooner. While I expected them to end our relationship eventually, doing it on my birthday and right before college felt especially cruel. I pleaded with them to let me stay until I graduated and offered to cover my tuition, but their minds were made up. They wanted me out of their lives to pursue their dream of starting a business and traveling the country in an RV. I had nothing against their plans, but not at the expense of my future. Desperate to change their minds, I tried every tactic, crying, begging, even bargaining, but nothing worked. They gave me a month to vacate, and though I had a job as a cashier and was saving for a car, I decided to leave. I was hurt and angry. My feelings shifted from indifference to deep resentment. Within 2 days, I reached out to relatives for help. Most turned their backs, reinforcing my belief that I had no support system. My friends were sympathetic but had their own lives to manage. Fortunately, one of my mother's cousins, Uncle Kevin, responded to my email and offered me a place to stay on the condition that I contribute around the house. I packed my bags and moved to Utah without informing my parents. They never asked where I was going, and I didn't say goodbye. Uncle Kevin was kind, requiring me to help him with household tasks, but he also offered me a job at his popular diner as a cashier. If I worked hard, he promised to cover my tuition. He was a bit eccentric but well off, and I was grateful for his support. Thanks to his mentorship, I successfully paid for my college education. After graduating, I offered to repay him, but he insisted I focus on my future. Tragically, he passed away from a stroke just a few years later. Before he could collect anything from me, I'll always be thankful for everything he did, including attending my wedding and stepping in where my parents had failed. Because of their strained relationship with Uncle Kevin, my parents had no idea where I was living or how I funded my education. I didn't hear from them again until a few weeks ago, when they found me on social media through a cousin. They apologized for the past and expressed a desire to meet my wife and son, citing a need to see their grandson. I was skeptical and almost didn't respond, but they quickly followed up, clearly trying to manipulate my emotions. Despite my reservations, I agreed to have them over for my son's birthday. After discussing it with my wife, who understood the history and was supportive, I decided to invite them. It had been 10 years since they threw me out, and while I didn't seek reconciliation, I sensed my wife wanted to include them. On the day of the party, my parents arrived an hour early for a little one-on-one time. The atmosphere was tense, and small talk felt forced after I introduced them to my wife and son. They were mostly polite and respectful, but everything shifted when my wife went into the kitchen to make my dad some tea. That's when my mother leaned in and said she needed to discuss something important, something she didn't want to say in front of my wife. Once it was just the three of us, my parents offered another half-hearted apology. They claimed they had finally come to their senses, realizing how poorly they had treated me during my childhood. I was taken aback. It seemed like a genuine moment of contrition, but before I could process their apology, they dropped the bombshell: they needed money. Apparently, they had spent most of their savings on their travels and were now struggling to cover their bills. They wanted my help. They had noticed that my wife and I were doing well. She's a real estate agent, and I work in banking, so they thought we could afford to bail them out. I felt my irritation flare. Their earlier apologies suddenly felt hollow, as if they were nothing more than a prelude to a financial plea. They even tried to use their grandson as leverage to soften my heart, and while it hadn't worked on me, it had gotten to my wife. I couldn't blame her. She missed having family around and was eager to fix things, but now I regretted inviting them. I didn't respond immediately because my wife returned with tea and coffee, looking genuinely happy. My mother told me to think it over. My wife, noticing my discomfort, asked what we had discussed, but I brushed it off, saying we could talk later. I wanted to avoid a confrontation while guests were about to arrive. My wife continued chatting with my parents, and they seemed to enjoy the conversation, but I sat in silence, wishing they would leave before I exploded. Fortunately, the first guests arrived just in time. I threw myself into the party preparations, and when it was time for my son to cut the cake, everything went smoothly, and everyone had a great time. Just as I was about to slip into the kitchen with my wife, my parents interrupted me, asking if I had made a decision about their request yet. That's when I snapped. I told them they could wait in the living room with the other guests, and I'd let them know shortly. Once everyone had their cake, I stood in the middle of the living room and began a speech I had mentally prepared since my parents had cornered me earlier. I introduced my parents to the guests, and they looked pleased, but their smiles faded as I transitioned into the story of my childhood, the day they kicked me out and how I ended up living with Uncle Kevin. I wrapped it in light-hearted humor, and the guests laughed, but my parents looked humiliated, while my wife maintained a blank expression. I mentioned how we hadn't spoken in 10 years after they abandoned me, and how, against my better judgment, I had agreed to meet them to introduce them to their grandson. I managed to joke about how at least my parents weren't trying to take my money this time, framing it all in a way that kept the mood light. As the evening wore on and guests began to leave, my parents were the first to exit. They rushed out, shooting me furious looks, but thankfully remaining silent. I was relieved. I didn't want any drama right outside my home. Once everyone had left and we had put our son to bed, I finally had a moment to talk with my wife, but before I could say anything, she lashed out, calling my speech unnecessary and stupid. She insisted I apologize to our guests for making them uncomfortable and to my parents for humiliating them. I tried to explain what my parents had really come for, but she was unsympathetic, saying I ruined our son's birthday and made it all about me. I thought this was unfair. He was only 3 years old and wouldn't remember any of this in the future. The guests seemed to find my storytelling entertaining, not awkward. In light of my son's birthday, I felt it was important to express how disappointed I was in my parents, but my wife didn't see it that way. She demanded I apologize for my behavior. I was already stressed from dealing with my parents, and her reaction felt dismissive of my feelings, especially since she knew the context of their visit. I snapped at her, pointing out that I had only invited them because she wanted me to. If anyone should be more understanding, it was her. That hit a nerve, and she began to cry. I immediately regretted snapping at her and tried to comfort her, but she pushed me away, insisting I was self-involved and hypocritical. She wouldn't talk to me until I apologized to everyone at the party. She moved her things into the guest bedroom that night, and we haven't spoken since. I don't think I owe anyone an apology. I didn't think my actions were out of line, and I feel like my wife is overreacting. My parents haven't reached out since, and nobody from the party has mentioned my speech either. It feels like she's blown this out of proportion. I tried to do everything the right way, and when my parents tried to manipulate me again, I reacted emotionally. I believe I have every right to stand up for myself after everything they did to me. I might consider apologizing to my wife for calling her self-involved. That wasn't fair, but beyond that, I don't think I owe anyone anything. I don't plan on apologizing to my parents, especially after they left me at 18 and tried to ask for money after 10 years of silence. I feel justified in how I handled things at my son's birthday party. Update 1. I had a conversation with my wife today. The comments on my original post were pretty mixed about how I handled things, so I decided to put everything aside and just talk to her. It's been 6 days since the party, and we've spent those days not speaking and sleeping in separate rooms. We've tried to keep things low-key for our son, but since he's too young to notice, there really wasn't a reason for us not to communicate. Before we left for work today, I stopped her and said we needed to talk. Thankfully, she didn't brush me off, and with our son busy having breakfast in the other room, we had a quiet moment. I told her I was sorry for calling her self-involved, but aside from that, I didn't feel I had anything else to apologize for. I assured her that I didn't ruin the party. No one seemed to care about my speech since no one had mentioned it to me, not even my parents. I expressed my belief that she had overreacted, then waited for her response. She admitted she had overreacted and explained that as her anger cooled over the past few days, she realized she had been selfish and hadn't considered my feelings. She also acknowledged that she had indirectly pushed me to invite my parents, as she really wanted a happy family dynamic for us. I wasn't wrong about that after all, and she apologized for it. Her reasons made sense emotionally. She had longed for a complete family for our son, something she didn't have growing up. She wanted our son to experience the love from grandparents that she missed out on when her parents passed away too soon. Since she had been raised by her grandparents, the absence of family connections weighed heavily on her, and she recognized that her past had contributed to her outburst. I also took the opportunity to apologize for not communicating better about these feelings, which had led to our misunderstanding. In the end, we talked things through and agreed that we should consider couples counseling in addition to our individual therapy. Update 2. I didn't expect to be back so soon, but here I am, thanks to my parents. They sent me a lawsuit claiming I stole $50,000 from them before I left 10 years ago, and now they want it back since they've finally tracked me down. This is obviously absurd, and I feel sorry for the attorney who's taken on this ridiculous case. They must be desperate for clients. I'm not entertaining this nonsense and have already contacted my lawyer. My wife has rescinded her earlier comments about my needing to apologize to my parents because now she sees them for who they truly are. They might think they can manipulate me just because I was polite during their visit for my son's birthday, but I've moved past that. Update 3. I decided to share everything online. I posted all the details on my Facebook profile, and while it's only been 20 minutes, I'm anticipating some angry messages, especially since I mentioned how no one in my family supported me when I needed help. Now that I'm in a decent position, they all act friendly, but I've never invited them to any events. My relatives who abandoned me in the past have suddenly turned friendly, probably hoping to benefit from my job at the bank. Update 4. It's been almost 3 days since my last update. After I made that post, my parents went ballistic, calling me repeatedly to get me to take it down. I only agreed after they texted me promising to withdraw their lawsuit. Once I had that in writing, they blocked me. The real drama came from my relatives, who I had named in the post. They lashed out, leaving nasty comments about me, my wife, and even my son, proving my point about their character. Ironically, their kids were the ones who apologized for their parents' behavior, which was surprising but appreciated. I've taken the post down now, but plenty of people saw it, and it's clear that those who turned their backs on me in the past are facing their own consequences. In short, my parents withdrew their case, I reconnected with my relatives, and my wife and I are still going strong. Thanks for your support, Reddit. I think I'm going to take a break for now. Signing off. Bye.